Hello, and what a great day to sew something wonderful. I'm Kia with Kia B, and today in the Hive we're going to be working on a little handmade project. It is a roll-up sewing organizer. It's got some cute little embroidery on the front, and it unties so you can actually hold all of your embroidery supplies. You can use it for other things as well. It's got two great vinyl pockets, one at the top and one at the bottom. And then it has just some accessories, some snaps to hold scissors, and a little piece of wool to hold pins and sewing needles, and an embroidery hoop. Also in the bottom I've tucked in my English paper piecing hexies, and so this is just really fun. We got the pattern a few months ago in our sew sampler boxes, and it is from Cotton Way by Bonnie Olaveson. It's called Stitch Lovely Things number 995, and I'll be really honest, I haven't done this pattern yet because I was nervous. It looks really advanced and complicated, and I just didn't feel like I would be able to do that. But let me just tell you, I got the instructions out. We got everything we needed except for binding and batting in the box, and I got the instructions out and I studied them and started reading them, and I thought, oh my goodness, she does such a wonderful job of explaining this. I feel like I could actually do this. So I pulled out the instructions, I gathered all my materials, and I got to work. So why don't you grab your pattern, come in a little closer, we'll flip it over and talk about the materials that you're going to need in this project. On the back of our pattern, it actually shows us all the materials that we'll need, and we got the majority of them in a sew sampler box. So out of the handmade fabric that they gave us, I've chosen 2 fat quarters for the front and back of my bag. So this is going to be the front of the bag. I love the little cross stitch pattern, and then here's the inside of the bag. So you'll need 2 fat quarters for that. You'll have a little bit left over. And then next you'll need just a piece of white linen. I chose a scrap. It's only going to end up being 3 inches by 9 inches, so you just need a small piece. And you're going to pick an embroidery pattern that they've included in the pattern. You're going to pick one of those and stitch it onto this white fabric. So there are 2 choices, and you can see on the front of your bag, or I'm sorry, front of your pattern, it either says stitch or handmade. This is my second one, and so for the first one I chose handmade, and for this one I chose stitch, and they both turn out super cute. The next thing on our list is a half of a yard of 44-inch wide fabric for bias binding. I've already cut my bias binding from the last project, and so I'm just going to use it in this one. It's this really cute red, and I'll show you how to piece those together. And then you need clear vinyl. You only need a very small amount of clear vinyl. If your quilt shop is like mine, they will only sell it in half a yard increments, so I have plenty of bags to make for the future. The next thing is you'll just need some batting. It's a smaller piece, so scrap batting is fantastic for this. Then you'll just need some little things like scrap ribbon. I've chosen actually Moda's little ruler ribbon that they tie their fabric with. And you'll need some scissors for sure. And you will definitely need a marking tool. Some people like to use chalk, some people like to use a friction pin. I'm actually just using the Sew Line pencil this time. And you need this to mark your pattern on your white fabric, and then you'll need this for a couple more times throughout the project. The other materials that you'll need for this are totally customizable to the way that you want to make your bag. The first bag I made holds, like I said, my embroidery floss at the top. It holds my hexies at the bottom. You've got an embroidery hoop, some little scissors, which you need a snap for if you've got like a cam snap, and a scrap piece of wool to hold needles. And so I've got all of that just kind of laid to the side for when I get to that part I can kind of feel what I want to do with the actual bag. So let's go ahead and get this started and take one stitch at a time. The first thing in our pattern is to trace our embroidery onto our white fabric. With our embroidery floss, we will stitch on the markings that we've made with our friction pin or sew pencil or chalk marker, whichever you've decided to use. And this takes just a little bit of time. Then you're going to want to trim this down to 2.5 by 9 inches. So really you can see this takes up very little fabric. Make sure that your stitching is centered once you've trimmed it down. For the other cutting instructions, I have everything already cut. Now, I want to address this because we've had some questions. In order to keep the integrity of the pattern maker's design, I don't actually give out the measurements of the patterns. This is so that you're still able to go out and purchase their patterns. I'm not just giving you everything from the pattern. You could do it watching my video and not have to buy their pattern. I do want to respect their hard work in designing patterns, and so you'll want to refer to your pattern for all the cutting instructions. The second thing that we need to do is to take our embroidery. It is trimmed down to 2.5 inches by 9 inches, and the front of our bag. So it has listed 2 pieces for the front of the bag. This is our top portion, and we're going to take our embroidery strip. We're going to flip it right sides together. We're just going to stitch along this line. Then I'm actually not going to press it open. I know that surprises some of you, but I'm not going to press it open. I'm just going to finger press it to one side. Then I will take our smaller portion of the front, which is just the bottom of our bag, and I will attach it here at the bottom of our embroidery strip. So why don't you come over to the sewing machine and I'll show you exactly how that works. So I have the top outer portion of our bag and the top of my embroidery. I'm just going to put right sides together. I've got opal set up here with a 1/4 inch foot, and so I'm going to take a scant 1/4 inch seam all the way down the top of my bag. I'm just going to finger press those to the outer fabric here at the machine. I'll formally press it as soon as I'm finished. Now at the bottom of my embroidery piece, I'm going to attach the bottom of the outside fat quarter. So I'm going to put this on just like this. And again, take a 1/4 inch seam all the way down. So now I'll head over to the ironing board and I will press this towards the outside and this one toward the outside bottom fabric. Now the first thing I need to do is set the seam that I've already sewn, and so I don't want to lose that. And plus I really like to actually set my embroidery floss stitches. To me it just makes it settle nicely and it just looks a lot nicer. So I'm going to do that. Then I'm going to press toward my outside fabric because the white fabric is actually pretty thin and you'll be able to see it. So I'm going to do kind of finger pressing first to lay that down. And then finger pressing to the top here, like this. Then I'll come through with my iron and more formally press. Remember, don't actually push, pull, or, try to finagle your fabric around. That will kind of catch on and it'll disorient your fabric. So you don't want to do that. Just make sure you have a nice, good edge pressed. Now, I actually like to starch at this point because we're almost done with the front of the bag. The next thing to do is the quilting portion of it. And so I'm just going to spray some starch on here. Let that kind of set for just a second. And take my iron with no steam on it, just kind of press it over again. It just kind of gives some firmness to the stitched fabric. Now I hope you didn't put your embroidery floss too far away, because next we're going to come in again and stitch with the embroidery floss just one more time. We're going to take our embroidery floss and we're just going to stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from our seam line onto the white fabric. Just stitch a really nice traveling line. So let's head over to the cutting mat and we'll do that. here I am all finished with my top stitching. Now you can see my fabric has gotten a little wonky because I pulled and stretched it. I'm going to take that over to the ironing board really quick, zap that, and it's going to be good as new. So the next thing we need to do is our bias binding. We need to prepare our vinyl pockets and we need our binding for that. I've chosen a really fun red binding and I've already cut mine because I had extra left over from the project before. But I'm going to show you, I'm going to walk you through right now how to cut that. So with the inside of our bag, I'm going to use this as an example. We've got our grain, our straight of grain, which has no give to it whatsoever. Then we've got our cross grain, which has a little bit of give to it, not too much. But then you've got this diagonal that if you grab it, you've got a lot of thread there. So it's really at this 45-degree angle. I'll show you if you fold up like this. You've got a 45-degree angle. That has a lot of stretch to it. This is just a typical cotton fabric, and so that's how you know you've got your straight of grain, your cross grain, and then you've got your 45-degree bias grain. And that's what we want. Because we've got the rounded corners on our bag, I'll show you on the finished one here. Because we've got our rounded corners, here we need a bias binding to be able to stretch around the corner. And it finishes it off very, very nicely. So what I did, and this is how I cut mine, I would just fold up my fabric like I was cutting a regular binding, okay? So I typically line it up straight. I've got a little overhang here. I cheat maybe just a little, but on my mat, and let me move my mat over here so you can see it. You can see that I have angles. I have a 30, a 45, and a 60-degree angle. I turn my mat a little bit, okay? Just kind of turn it diagonal. I'm going to line the top straight edge of my fabric with that 45-degree angle, okay? So now, straighten it back out, and I line it up with this 45-degree angle, okay? So that's going to give me my bias binding. I would lay my ruler on top of it like this, and I made a cut, okay? So I made a cut that straightens this out here. These two pieces here aren't going to make very large pieces of bias binding. Then I would take and cut my binding from there. So I use 2.5-inch binding. I think the pattern calls for 2.5-inch wide, or I'm sorry, 2.25 wide binding. I just like 2.5-inch. It's my standard. It's just what I kind of go to. So I have cut my strips at 2.5, and you see that they come out with this angle, okay? And we need 75 inches total of bias binding. So how do I take this little, what is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11-inch binding and make it 75. That can be a little tricky, so let me show you. So what you're going to want to do is lay out your angle, your 45-degree angle here. Lay your second piece with right sides together across that, and you're gonna have dog ears, and that's okay. We're going to trim those off. So you're going to line these up so that you've got a little overhang here and a tiny little dog ear here. I'm going to grab a pin and I'm going to throw it right here to pin this together. Okay, just like this. I'm going to head over to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew 1/4 inch, just like I would when I was joining regular binding. Okay, and when I open them, look what happens. It's going to make a continuous strip of binding. I'm going to continue to do that until I have about 75 or more inches of binding. So I'll meet you right back here as soon as I'm finished. My binding sewn together, so I have a continuous line, and I've pressed them open. Now what I want to do is come to the end and just make a straight line across, because we won't need that little triangle there. So I'll line it up and cut straight across. And that gives me a good starting point. Now the instructions say that we will need 2 strips 9 inches long. Because it is a bias binding, I actually cut it about 8 3/4 inches because 9 ends up being a little bit too long. So I'm going to line this up, and don't worry about your dog ears. Those will come off at some point. And I'm going to do about 8 3/4 inch cut. Now I'm going to take both of these strips over to the ironing board, and we typically, in our binding, we press it in half, right? So I'm going to press it in half first, but because this is a finished pocket edge, I'm going to press it in half, then open it, and press each side to the middle. This is going to make like a nice little bias kind of tape. And we're going to sew that onto our vinyl pockets. So let me head on over to the ironing board and do that, and then I'll show you how we attach them before we head to the sewing machine. So now I've got the binding all pressed. It's pressed in half and then half again. So there are 2 nice finished edges. You'll need 2 pins for this next part. Let's go ahead and start with 1 piece of vinyl. This might be kind of hard for you to see on camera because it is clear. But you're going to just insert that vinyl right in the middle of that binding. And remember, we did cut it a little bit short, and that's okay. I'm going to center that up, and then I'm going to stick a pin right in the middle of it. That vinyl does actually pin pretty easily. So I'm just going to stick a pin right in the middle and have that all ready to go at my sewing machine. And let's do the second piece. Got it nicely pressed here. And then I'm going to take my vinyl, put it in the center, make sure it's really butt up straight to that edge. And then put a pin in here as well. Now let's head over to the sewing machine, and I'll talk about how to kind of get a clean top stitch on this binding. I'm going to start at one end and butt my bias binding up to the edge. Make sure that it's all the way in the center. I'm going to take about a 2.5 stitch length, and I'm going to go really as close to the edge into the vinyl as I can. Now be careful. What I've learned is that vinyl, your feed dogs don't really love to feed the vinyl through, so you may need to take it a little more slowly and kind of ease your way into it. Now see how I kind of just stretched and pulled that so that my bias binding was tight, and then it also, you know, went across the whole length of my side. So I'll just trim off the threads and I'll do the second piece. Now that I have both pockets done, the next thing I want to do before moving away from my sewing machine is actually make a quilt sandwich. And what we're going to do is layer the top sewn portion of our bag and the inside portion of our bag with batting. So you're just going to make a typical quilt sandwich, and you're free to quilt this as you would like. The instructions actually call for you to make some certain markings. Those help in the way the bag folds. So you want to make sure that you include those markings in your quilting, but definitely refer to your pattern as where you're going to mark those. So I'm actually going to grab my quilt sandwich and I'm going to sew those lines before we move away from the sewing machine. I lowered my stitch length to a 1.5, and that way it gave it a tighter stitch, and you can see it, I mean, it just flops over as soon as you hold it up. And then I echoed on my embroidery piecing here. So let's head back over and I'm going to trim this down to size. Alright, so the next thing, I'm just going to trim off some excess batting. We've got our embroidery on the front. You're going to flip it over, and next we're going to attach our vinyl pockets. So make sure you trim away any extra threads. I've got a couple here of extra threads. I'm just going to get out of the way. We're going to attach these next. These are so simple, and really we're almost there. Other than binding, we are almost there. So we are going to attach one at each end, okay? So you're going to attach one at this end, then you're going to slide it down, and with the binding going towards the center, you're going to attach the other one at the end. Don't worry about this extra batting that I have sticking out here. You might have some sticking out as well. Your liner, your inside liner may have shifted a little bit, but don't worry, that's really going to be covered up by binding and these vinyl pockets. So these are going to look really, really nice. So you're going to go over, we're going to sew 3 sides of these all the way around. This is another one that your vinyl doesn't like to go through the plate on my sewing machine. So sometimes I have to lift up and kind of sew, do a little free motion sewing on the top of it. The only other thing that I could do if I really wanted to was to go ahead and pin my binding on and sew my binding and my vinyl pockets in the same direction. But I think I'm going to do it the way the directions say and sew this together first. So I'm just going to leave you right here. As soon as I come back, I'll have these sewn on and we'll talk about binding next. After binding, y'all, it's just personalizing it. So adding your ribbon, adding your straps, anything like that. I mean, after that, we're almost done. So I'm going to head over, I'm going to get these sewn on, and I will be right back. How did you do on your vinyl pockets? Mine are looking kind of nice. I really like that the use of these. They're very nice. The next thing in the instruction is to round our corners from here on the front. I just chose something that I could trace around that I felt like would leave a nice little corner. So I just have this candle holder that I kind of sat here, and I'm going to go around with my rotary cutter. There is a template in the pattern that you can cut out if you'd like. I didn't want to cut mine out because I honestly want to keep this pattern in case I want to make more since I have so much vinyl. So I'm going to lay this here and cut around it. And it's okay that you're cutting off your stitches. That happens, and that's totally fine. We're going to encase them in binding. Just be very, very careful with your rotary cutter. You do not want any accidents. And yes, you are going to be cutting on some of your vinyl as well. That's okay, because we're going to encase it as well. Those are kind of looking nice. Okay. Now I've got rounded corners. That looks really, really nice. I'm very, very excited about that. Okay, so the next thing to do, add our binding. I've pressed mine in half, and I'm just going to start somewhere in the middle here. I'm going to sew it on the inside. That way I can wrap it around to the outside. When you're going towards your corners, just kind of take your sewing machine. You'll see, because I'll take you over to my sewing machine, and I'm just going to kind of ease these in under the presser feet. And that way, you know, it just kind of makes that a really nice round binding. That's why we are using bias binding, because it does have so much of a stretch that we're going to be able to round those corners nicely, and when we flip it over to the other side, it's going to look really nice. So let's go ahead and head over to the sewing machine and we'll get this started. So I've lined my raw edge up to the edge of the inside of my bag. I'm just going to start maybe 1.5 inches or 2 inches down. I have finished one edge of my binding. Really, I probably don't do the end of this binding the way that you're supposed to. I do it as to what I know will finish well. And so I finished the edge of this, and I'll just tuck the remaining piece under here. It'll be a little bit bulky, but it will have a nice finish. One thing I want you to do after you get your binding sewn onto the back, I want you to test these corners. I want you to see how well because I didn't believe it. A bias strip just, I mean, automatically folds around those corners. That's going to make it really nice for you to sew around when you get to that part. Then the next thing that we're going to want to do is attach our tie. So let me show you on this one. I've attached a tie so that it can tie shut. So before you sew your binding on, this is when you need to attach that. So I just cut a couple of inches each. I think I did maybe 8 inches each. And so I'm just going to kind of guesstimate that. I've got my 2 ties. The first one is going to go under our embroidery piece. And the way that we're going to stitch this is actually backwards. We're going to stitch it so it goes over our embroidery piece. And then that way, when we fold our binding over, it's actually going to fold back this way, and we're going to top stitch over that into our binding. So I'm going to pick an eyeball about midway, and I'm going to lift my binding so I make sure not to sew it. I'm not ready to sew my binding down just yet, so I'll pull that out of the way. I'm just going to back stitch over and over a couple of times. Pull it out. And now let's go to the other end. Now the other side, if you flip it over, is actually in the middle of our bag. I didn't quite get it in the middle, you see, but it's on this line here that we marked, and so I'm going to sew back and forth just across that a couple of times. So let me show you where that's at on our bag here. So this line here, so if this is the front of our bag, here's our embroidery. I'm going to go all the way to this kind of center line here. And I'm going to sew it so it actually goes in the opposite direction. So we're going to sew it so it goes toward the bottom of the bag. Make sure that your pocket is out of the way so you don't close your pocket shut. And then eyeball about midway for that. Now we've got our 2 ties. That's going to be able to close our bag shut, and it's going to be really, really helpful. The next thing that we'll need to do is to flip our bag, flip our bag over, and we're going to go ahead and attach our binding to the other side. I would not suggest starting on the corners. Leave those for about midway. So when I started putting my binding on, I started over here. So I'm actually going to start on the opposite side. That gives this side time to kind of resettle. So I'm going to flip it over, and just like I would a typical binding, I'm just going to start sewing. When I get to this edge over here, I'm going to again ease it around my sewing machine. So take your time with this. You want it to finish nicely, so make sure and take your time. I'm using a white thread, so I definitely want to make sure that my stitches look nice. So here I am coming up on my tie. Remember we've sewn it going this direction. So I'm actually going to flip it over across my across my binding, and I'm going to sew over the top of that. So our binding is finished. We just have threads to cut here. Go ahead and fold your bag and see how nice it looks. I mean, it's looking very, very nice. I really like it. Okay, so the next thing to do is to accessorize the bag the way you would want it. On my original bag, I've put snaps and an embroidery hoop holder and a little wool kind of needle thing, and so go ahead and accessorize it the way you would have it. I love it. I think it's adorable. I think that it's going to work out really well. So you go ahead and take some time. I'm going to take some time and kind of accessorize mine, and because it's going to someone very special, and so I want to do something that I know that she would really like. So I'm going to do that, and I'll meet you guys back at the cutting table. Y'all, let me just tell you how not perfect quilting is. And it's okay. I'm not even really that worried about it. I finished my bag, and as you can see, it's a little bit shorter, and I was trying to figure out why. And it's because we all make mistakes. And what have I said in videos in the past? My number one rule is don't point out your mistakes to others. This is a gift. My best friend and her family are coming into town this weekend, and I'm so delighted. They moved away about a year ago, and we don't get to see them as often, and so I'm so excited they're coming into town. We're celebrating birthdays. Our sons are about a month apart, and so we are having a big birthday party for them this weekend, and her daughter's birthday is actually this weekend as well, and so that's who this is for. And she is learning how to sew, and that just makes me really excited and really happy. Her dad bought them a sewing machine, and so they're learning at home, and I wanted to just make a little beginner's sewing kit for her. So as I'm finishing, and I told you, like, go make your embellishments to however you want to, because, you know, she isn't gonna want the embroidery hoop, and she may not want all the embroidery floss and all of that. She really is in the stage of, I love to make pillows, I love to make little purses, and anything that she can sew on her own. And so I want to foster that. When I was putting on the embellishments, I thought, I don't think I have enough room as when I did the first bag that I sewed. And let me just tell you, I figured out, you can see that it's not as long, as wide as mine was, and it's because I made my vinyl pockets, I mismeasured. They're both the same size, but they're the wrong size. But you know what? It's okay. It still fits together, it still rolls up really nicely, and it ties. I'm okay with that. The only reason I'm pointing it out to you is because I want you to know that in the world of quilting, nothing is perfect. Sometimes your 1/4 inch seam is not going to be a 1/4 inch seam, and that's okay. You need to learn to give yourself grace as you're sewing. With that being said, give each other grace as well. We're all here to learn from each other, and this is just a learning process for me. Double check. I have a magnet that says measure twice, cut once. And I was going along and filming and getting ready to film and just cut them at the wrong size, but that's okay. They're the same size, they fit in the bag, I'm okay with it. So here's my finished bag. It says stitch on the outside. I tied it together. Let me show you what I put on the inside for her. So I've got my vinyl pockets at the top and bottom. On the bottom one, let me see if you can see this. I put some binding clips. I think that she will really love these. I think that she'll use them. And they're a little bit more safe for kids than regular pins. But she is, you know, growing, and so I gave her a couple of pins. I need to include a sewing needle in there as well. Then I included a snap with some scissors, and so the snap will just come right off, and she'll be able to use the little embroidery scissors. And then something I did for her that I didn't do on mine is I hung a spool of thread here. It unties from the bottom, so she'll be able to use that. I think I'll put a few little fabric scraps in here so she can kind of sew when she wants to. So this little pattern is great, and if there's something that I learned other than quilting isn't perfect all the time, don't be scared to try new patterns. You know, I had to really get over the hump of I'm nervous to do this pattern because it looks complicated. Because this pattern does look complicated. I never thought I could make a bag that rolled up, and I didn't think that I would be very good at bias binding. I'm not very good at bias binding, but it's a learning process. And so I tried it, I liked it, I made a second one. And so I'm definitely going to keep this pattern. I've got enough vinyl, as you've heard. I have plenty of fat quarters left from our homemade fabric, and so I love this. Don't be nervous to try things that you may or may not be very good at. It's fabric. You can replace it. It's okay. And the great thing about that sew sampler box is they give you lots of it. So just in that fat quarter bundle, I mean, we had, I think, 12 or 14 fat quarters just in that bundle, and you only use 2 per bag. That's at least you know, 6, 7 bags that you can trial and error. So step out of your comfort zone a little bit. It's okay. I'm excited. I'm glad that I did. So thank you so much for stitching with us today. If you have any questions or anything that you'd like to add, please comment down below. We love hearing from you guys, and we love just this community that we've been so welcomed into. So thank you so much for stitching with us in the hive today, and we hope that you have a great week.